All right, welcome to the second part of the critical theory. Yeah, there we go. So the other kind of big element in critical theories, and thinking about terms of who has power and who doesn't in society, is gender. And so there's a couple ways to take this. One is talk about feminist criminology and contributions, and you can even think about it in terms of tying to the last topic, conflict theory. And then the other part is to think about how gender relates to crime and sort of a more nuts and bolts approach to crime and criminal justice. So you think about feminist criminology, you trace it back to the women's rights movement in the 60s, and that shaped this in a couple ways. First is that it created activists in that time frame that started to focus on issues related to gender and crime. And so I think we're going to skip for this discussion of different forms of feminism. But the issue of most feminism is patriarchy and the issue of whether and the extent to which males have dominated political and legal power over females throughout history. And so one of the ways to kind of look at this is in the U.S. in the 60s, as women did accumulate power to vote and power in the law, that part of what happens is they shape the debate over some crimes. And so there's two really good examples. One is marital rape. Until, this is even more recent, until the 70s and 80s in some states, it essentially wasn't legally possible to rape a spouse because the English common law basically said when you get married, both partners grant rights to their bodies to the other partner. So when you say I do, it means like I will in any circumstance. And so because of that, legally, technically, rape wasn't possible. And so a spouse could use force on their spouse to engage in sex, but legally it wasn't rape. All states now do have laws that make clear that rape is legally possible even in the context of marriage. And so partner violence has really changed fairly dramatically in the past 30 years. And so probably not even that long. I mean, when I was a kid, it was still this sort of crime for which the police did not use a lot of formal action. The police could show up, settle disputes, but it wasn't really, that's a family problem. It's not really a legal problem. And advocates for women have did a really good job of reframing that. It's a lot like drinking and driving, and how we think about drinking and driving, how much that's changed in the past 20 to 30 years. And so it's a crime for which police are now a lot more likely to enforce the law and to take seriously, that the criminal justice system is more likely to take it seriously and formally. And so it's a really good example, if you go back to conflict theory, to say, all right, well, conflict can include broad social segments. That would include gender. And so women did a really good job of forming interest groups that attacked these issues and that were successful in having the law changed in ways that benefited sort of their group. And so one way to look at feminists and their contribution is to say, well, they've shaped the law in ways that are consistent with that conflict approach. The other thing that happened is, in the 60s and 70s, where women had more opportunities, one of the opportunities they had was to go to graduate school. And one of the things they did is study crime and sociology and other disciplines. And by the 80s and 90s, they're looking around like, all you male criminologists haven't really done a good job explaining the relationship between gender and crime, or you've ignored it, which was true. It's something to think about when you go, all right, well, this gender ratio or gender gap that males commit 90% of homicides and 87 to 90% of robberies, and to just to step back and go, holy shit, that's what's going on? What would explain that? Whereas the sort of male criminologist approach was to say, well, kind of a male thing, so we're going to look at males and why they commit crime. To the extent that the gender gap is so large, right? The critical thing is to say, well, like, what's different between men and women? Is it how we parent boys and girls? I mean, if how we parent boys and girls was a big part of why we saw this gap emerge, then the policy implication would be, you start parenting boys like they're girls and homicide might go down by 80%. Obviously, I mean, there's a lot going on besides just parenting, but I mean, to think about how important that difference is and what it could tell a criminologist, and then you sort of marvel at how criminologists just ignored it for 100 years. So one thing that's happened is that we've paid a lot more attention to these issues that we see, this gender gap. Ironically, one of the first things that happened is people started to get up in arms that maybe the gender gap was shrinking. In the late 70s, early 80s, we saw women being more likely to get arrested and the sort of female crime rate going up. And so there's this sort of backlash to women's liberation, like, oh, it's the dark side of women's lib. And what we figured out is that the gender gap shrunk from like really huge to also really huge, but just not as much. It shrunk just a little bit. But if you look at the data, what's startling is not how much it shrunk. It's startling how big of the gap there still is, that not a lot has changed. And so most of what criminology is about now is still trying to figure out what that's all about. Is it about what we do socially? Does it relate to biology somehow? And so my sort of read of the evidence is that the answer is yes. It's a lot of those things. Some of the most promising research is on the sort of idea of sex roles and masculinities, that sort of, it depends on what meaning gender has in your society. If part of the identity of men is to be sort of emotionally callous and aggressive and so on and so forth, then yeah, that probably helps explain why men commit more violent crime and commit more homicides. It seems also really likely that biology does play some role, that men and women have different muscle masses, different levels of testosterone, and so on and so forth. So there's some really interesting research finally going on there. The other issue with gender and crime is what's called generalizability. Because most criminologists were dudes, they created theories that were basically either ignored gender or were blatantly sort of sexist. Cohen's a guy we haven't talked about. He created a version of strain theory. His idea was that basically as kids got into high school, the strain was, could they finish high school and achieve the American dream? And poor kids found themselves in trouble because they couldn't meet up to the sort of middle class measuring rod. It was all about men and achieving the American dream. And he had a chapter about females, and like all their strain was from being unable to attract one of these males that was going to achieve the American dream. So to the extent that theories did address gender, it was often sort of in a sexist way. Most theories didn't really just talk about it. So I mean, you think about all the theorists, the Merton, Sutherland, I mean, all the theorists that we've talked about, with the exception of Terry Moffat, are all dudes. And so I think it's a fair question to say, do theories created by dudes, are they inadequate? So we looked at that throughout the 90s and the early aughts to say, well, let's test that. And it turns out that the so-called mainstream theories, the strain theories, the learning theories, the control theories, they do pretty well. In fact, some of them, the Hershey's social bond theory, did better explaining female crime than male crime. And so on the one hand, you go, well, all right, we looked at that, and it seems like theories created by men still can adequately explain female crime. But I think it's also important to say, is there stuff we missed because we sort of started out thinking about men and not women, sort of thinking about boys and where they went bad, as opposed to thinking about girls. And when you do that, I mean, one of the things that you see immediately when you start looking at late adolescence, early adulthood, and young women who have gotten into trouble and end up incarcerated is that just the enormous amount and the high percents of physical and sexual abuse that they've experienced in their life. Just as trauma, it just smacks you in the face. Like, and then you say, well, what sort of mainstream theories have physical and sexual abuse as in childhood as like one of the central things that cause crime? And the answer is none. So I think that's really a good example of something that gets missed because you're starting out a theory sort of thinking about men and boys and how they become criminal. So, it's not uncommon for institutionalized population of females to have experienced 70-80% of them to have experienced sexual abuse. It just sort of cries out for like, well, this has got to be important, and why is it important, and how does it matter? And you can go, I mean, my perception as a guy with no uterus is that there's no sort of good feminist theory of crime right now yet, that there's precursors, that there's people doing really good theory work about it, but that we don't really have kind of a female theory of crime out there yet. You do have, these are kind of precursors. So Kathleen Daly has this, typologies often lead to crime. So they often lead to a good theory of crime. So she did this kind of deep dive into court cases, where females ended up getting convicted, and tried to trace back through, investigations, through pre-sentence reports, how these women ended up getting to where they were. And so she tried to kind of create these categories, and you see some of them, the street women, by and large, the big pathway there is these are, young girls experiencing conflict, often abuse and neglect at home, that end up out on the streets. And, once you're a 13, 14-year-old girl out on the streets, you figure out ways to survive. And so you end up in prostitution and using illicit drugs and other sorts of things that bring you into the attention of the police. And so, thinking back to here, right? Like, you start to tie in this idea that, well, there's a reason that girls who end up in jails have these really high rates of sexual and physical abuse. And so, this is another good example here, is these so-called drug-connected women, that one of the sort of consequences of the war on drugs and going after dealers is that you also sweep up the girlfriends and spouses of people, and they tend not to be the people that are in charge of a drug distribution program. They tend to be wives or girlfriends that allow the person to deal out of the apartment that is under their name, and so then they get swept up and punished in the same way. So it's a really good example of kind of a precursor to a full theory about female offending that tries to say, all right, well, and some of them, I think this is what she would call the other women. I mean, some of them commit crime for the same reason that boys and young men commit crime: greed, and impulsivity, and strain, and the other sorts of things that we've already talked about. But for some of them, there's probably pretty unique pathways that do have to do with gender. All right, so that's sort of the gender and crime issues. There's also gender and criminal justice. Really sort of interesting thing that happens is, right, most conflict theories say that the group of people that have the least amount of power end up getting treated more harshly. So if you're non-white, if you're poor, you're more likely to go to prison, you're more likely to be arrested, and so on and so forth. The research finding on gender is that the reverse happens, that females are less likely to get arrested, they're less likely to go to prison, and so it's not a strong relationship, but it's very consistent that most research that does this finds that females get treated more leniently. There's been a number of sort of theories about this. The chivalry one is the stereotype of a woman who gets pulled over and cries and, oh, poor me, and the police officer is like, oh, poor young lady, and lets them go. Research suggests the sort of bottom ones, the bottom 2 bullet points here are the ones that matter more. I already alluded to sort of this one here. You think about drug distribution, right? You get 2 people charged with first degree drug distribution because they were selling, 10 pounds of, I don't know, meth out of their house. It'd be a lot of 10 pounds would be a lot of meth. Anyhow, they do a raid and they're going to arrest the people that live there and own the house and charge them with first degree sale of drugs. And what happens is the person that's most actively involved is going to get the more likely to go to jail or prison and more likely to get a long sentence. And so if you don't think about that and you only say, well, oh, they're both charged with first degree distribution of drugs, but only the dude went to prison, you don't really understand why. And that happens a fair amount. Something like armed robbery, right? If the girlfriend or spouse drives the person to the armed robbery site, they get charged with the exact same crime, even though that they were less sort of culpable. And so if you do a bit more diving into these cases, you often find that when they are multiple people crimes, that women's involvement makes them less culpable in the crime. The other issue is this issue of whether somebody is familied. And so when men go to prison, most often the kids in the family go with the spouse, or the mother of the children. But when women go to prison, most often there's nobody left. And so there's a lot higher risk that these kids end up in foster care, and wards of the state. And so if you're a prosecutor, it's something you do consider. Now, is it fair or not? Like we always talk about this in face to face, that there's some people that are like, well, she should have thought of that before she committed the crime, which is fine. But at the end of the day, then you still end up with, a 6-year-old kid going into foster care. That 6-year-old kid who's not made bad decisions, who's not done anything wrong. And should we do that? The analogy, right? You go back to the Arthur Anderson case in corporate crime, right? That we went after Arthur Anderson, disbanded the company, and now you have some dude that worked in a little accounting spot in Arthur Anderson that lost their job even though they had nothing to do with the crime. And so that's something that prosecutors do consider, right? People disagree about whether they should consider it, but folks do consider it. And especially for cases where, as with almost all female crime, it's not violent crime. So it's a drug distribution crime, and you say, does this make sense for this crime, send this woman to prison and send her kids as wards of the state to foster care? And so if you look at the disparities between how females and males get treated, I think there's a lot more of this going on, especially if you're looking at jail versus not jail. Some of this may still be true if you're looking at police decision to arrest or not arrest for less serious crimes. All right. I think I've done enough damage for this topic. So I'm going to go ahead and end it here.